Good morning, everyone. All right, I think we can get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome. My name is Gyoko Bakhidze, and I am coming to you live from Ukraine, where I serve as Deputy Country Director for the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES. IFES is a global, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advances democracy for a better future. In Ukraine, our efforts to strengthen democratic progress are supported by the United States Agency for International Development, Global Affairs Canada, and UK Aid. Today's webinar is one of over 40 events held as part of the Global Democracy Coalition Forum, a virtual 24-hour event convened on the eve of the Summit for Democracy to be held later this week. The purpose of the forum and today's discussion on turning the authoritarian tide through civic education is to galvanize a global conversation on democracy as inputs to the summit itself. As President Biden noted in his call for the summit, democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, renew it. Responding to this call, today, we will hear from an esteemed group of panelists spanning 3 continents and many more time zones on why civic education is an essential ingredient for democratic renewal. And now, I'd like to welcome our panelists. Dr. Greer Burrows joins us from the United States, where she teaches as an associate professor at the College of New Jersey and supports IFES's mission worldwide as a civic education expert. Next, I will turn to Ukraine and welcome civic activist and co-founder of the Youth Democratic Association, Rashid Bilalov. Our third panelist, Dr. Tamar Karaya, joins us from Georgia, where she teaches as an associate professor at Tbilisi State University and leads Georgia's Civic Education Lecturers Association. Last but not least, a warm welcome to Sadia Afrin, associate professor who teaches at the Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman Science and Technology University in Bangladesh. Greer, Rashid, Tamar, Sadia, welcome to the discussion. Now, if I may, I'd like to jump right in and turn to Dr. Greer Burrows. Dr. Burrows received her doctorate degree in social studies education in 2010, and her dissertation focused on effective civic education practices to engage youth from historically marginalized communities. Over the past decade, Dr. Burrows' work in emerging democracies with IFES has included the development of university-level civic education courses in Georgia, Ukraine, and Armenia, along with training for course professors on interacting teaching methods and working with students on civic engagement initiatives. Dr. Burrows has also authored several evaluation reports with IFES, and other works of hers appear in the publication such as the Journal of Teacher Education. Greer, welcome. Can you get us started, please, and help us understand what is civic education? What do we mean when we use this term?
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our participants. And thank you, Gio, for the introduction and for including me in this important conversation. The question, what is civic education, is not easily answered because there's not even clear agreement in the field of education. But what most of us who work in the area of democratic citizenship participation do agree on is that there are several vital components for effective civic education. And the first of those is to have knowledge of political systems, governmental systems, knowledge of democratic processes, democratic principles. So there's definitely a large knowledge component, but that's just one of the 3 prongs of effective civic education. The next prong is the development of skills that students need to acquire in order to effectively engage and participate in their societies. And these skills range from things like to be able to publicly speak, to advocate for an issue, to critically research information. So it's a broad range of skills, and so effective civic education needs to be actively developing these skills among students. And then the third prong is this idea that we need to foster values and attitudes that are necessary to support a healthy democracy. And these are things like a respect for the rule of law, to respect and actually appreciate and welcome diverse perspectives, and to value civic discourse as a way to work towards informed decision making. So any really effective, robust civic education course really has to include all of these elements. And I would say that traditionally, when we think about what the curriculum, the content, we've always been very focused on these ideas of studying like how the government is structured, the role that political parties play, the role that individual citizens play. But I would say that in the 21st century, what we have really recognized the need for is to also develop students' media and digital literacy skills. So that's also become an essential component when we talk about effective civic education.
Thank you, Greer. And how has civic education, from your perspective, evolved in the United States over time?
So this is a really interesting question, and the structure of education in the United States is a civic education lesson in itself, because in the U.S. we have a system of federalism, which means that there are certain areas of authority that have been given to the states, and then there's areas of authority given to the national federal government. And education is actually reserved for the states. So we really live with a system where we have more than 50 different sets of guidelines for education in our country. So what that means is that there is no clear path for civic education. We have this really, it's at the individual state level, which has led us to a situation where some states have very vigorous civic education guidelines and programs, and other states don't. So just to give you a sense of where we stand, in a report that was issued by the Center for American Progress and Civic Education in 2019, it was found that of the 50 states, all but 11 actually did require some civic education in order to graduate from high school. And 20 required that there actually be some test along with that. But when we start to kind of peel back the layers and look at, well, what does that mean to require a course in civic education? Is this course a robust course where students are really going to be developing those skills and those attitudes that I talked about? In a similar report that was issued in 2020 by the Center for American Progress, they did analyze the states that required a course in civic education, and they found that only half actually of the states would actually meet the requirement for offering robust civic education. So the issue is a little bit complicated. It's not just, do we have civic education in the United States? It's also the quality of civic education. And I would suggest further that there's a lot of measures that show that we are not really succeeding in civic education. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we've invested deeply in what we call STEM, science, math, technology. We have really left civic education aside for several decades now in this country, and we're seeing the consequences of that. We see it on measures such as the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Civics, consistently shows that only about 20% of our students are considered to be proficient in their civic knowledge. We see this in things like low voter turnout rates, particularly among youth. There was also an Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania did a survey in 2020 that found that only about 1/4 of US citizens could actually name all 3 branches of government. So we definitely, and we can take that even further to look at, problems that we're facing with misinformation and disinformation and how polarized our country is getting. So I think, again, this is a multi-layered subject. It's not just a question of whether or not we have mandates for civic education. It's also the quality of the civic education.
Thank you, Greer, very much. In your earlier comments, you also pointed to some of the critical skills that are deepened through effective civic education. Could you please go a little deeper into this? What do you mean by critical skills, and how are these skills deepened? What do civic educators do to strengthen these skills amongst their students?
So, Gio, I'm a big advocate, as you know, in the work that I've done with IFES. We really focus on that civic education must be interactive. And so, kind of this maybe traditional style of schooling where the subject matter expert, the teacher, would be lecturing to the students and imparting knowledge, that there's really very, very little place for that in civic education. Well, of course, yes, the instructor does have the expertise knowledge. It's really a partnership with the students where the students are constantly being challenged to be part of their education. So, for instance, when I talk about the skills that are needed, high quality civic education does engage students in critical analysis of content. Students are presented with multiple perspectives and often are asked to first analyze these different sources of text or media to determine validity, to determine if bias exists. Then they are asked to synthesize across the different media sources or content that they're looking at to draw conclusions. Students are regularly asked to listen to diverse perspectives from their own classmates before forming decisions themselves. Students are also, we put them into situations where they have to do a lot of group work because they need to learn how to collaborate with others. And this directly relates not just to the skills for civic education, but also what we're calling these 21st century skills that are needed for success in the workplace. So we have a real opportunity to, when we're building these skills that are needed for effective civic engagement, we're also just really doing good education in terms of preparing our workforce. We need to be teaching our young people how to collaborate, how to listen to diverse perspectives, how to take into account varied sources of information before making an informed decision. We also really need to engage them in problem solving, critical thinking, creative thinking. These are all elements that need to be included in effective civic education, but I would really argue those are also elements that need to be included in education writ large in order to prepare our students for civic engagement, but also for the challenges of our global world.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, civic education is not a spectator sport, and it really requires the full engagement of everyone involved, the teacher and especially the students throughout the course.
Absolutely, Gio. And what I would echo is that I have found in my own research and many of my colleagues in the field, I mean, it's well documented that we know that effective civic education works. We know that when done correctly, students do develop a sense of efficacy at their own ability to influence the processes. They develop a desire to be part of that system. We know that they're more likely to engage civically as adults in measures such as they'll vote or they'll actually participate in civic life. So we do know what works. It's just we need to get more consensus about how to implement this across our schools.
Thank you. One follow-up question on this thread. When you talked about the definition of civic education, we heard the importance of fostering democratic attitudes, dispositions, values. What are some examples of these? What is a good democratic citizen, if we can put it in those words, from an academic perspective or from a national perspective?
It's such a great question, Gio. And this is one of the reasons why I feel like we're at a moment where we really need to take seriously the role that civic education can play or does play, because attitudes such as respecting not just respecting the right to free speech and freedom of expression, but actually valuing that freedom of expression is a necessary component in a democracy, not just so that individuals have the opportunity to say what they want, but so that when we can listen to those diverse views, when we can engage in civil discourse, we can actually find that middle ground, find that consensus, consider options that individually we don't necessarily think about. And that leads us all to a better place where we're more informed and where we're collaborating together on problem solving. So it's really not just that we want freedom of speech so that individuals get to say what they want. It's really better for the health of democracies. Some of the other values that I would be talking about, I mentioned before, respect for the rule of law. You know, we are at a crisis in many instances where people are challenging if systems are working, whether or not we should uphold the results of elections, whether or not we should respect decisions made by our courts. We need to have not just an understanding of how the government functions, but we also really need to value the rule of law. And that's not just for the citizens. Our elected officials need to value the rule of law. So these are some of those dispositions that effective civic education helps to develop.
Thank you very much, Greer. That leaves a lot for us to think about as we continue and welcome our next speaker out of Kharkiv, Ukraine, Rashid Bilalov. Rashid is a civic activist and alumni of a university-level civic education course named Democracy from Theory to Practice. He is also the co-founder of the Youth Democratic Association, which unites young democratic champions throughout Ukraine to promote active citizenship and democratic values through education and public engagement. Parallel to this, Rashid also leads discussions for youth on democracy called Freedom to Speak Up, and was recently selected as a community engagement fellow by the United States. Rashid, almost 8 years have passed since Ukraine's revolution of dignity. At that time, thousands of brave Ukrainians took to the streets to demand their right to choose their own future. Many sacrificed their lives in pursuit of that goal. I would like to hear from your perspective, what does civic education and active citizenship mean for a post-revolution of dignity Ukraine?
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate being part of this panel and share my views and perspectives on such an important question. Answering this question, I do think that civic education plays a vital role in a democratic progress in Ukraine right now. I do think that that through civic education, people understand that without their participation and the life of Ukraine, both politically and socially, there is no real democratic progress. So it goes to the fact that it creates this this feeling that every individual has a say in the country's life and its development and where it's going. It goes from the fact, so one of the examples of that, I just want to give examples right now, and when the social media has been introduced to the people in general, a lot of citizens have an opportunity to share their views on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, on all of those platforms to advance their opinion, to inform their viewers and audience about something of their concern. Many people, after the Revolution of Dignity, 8 years since then, took a step forward because of civic education, because of what they studied, because of of those values they have been carrying with them, took a step forward by creating a network of active people, and by founding a non-governmental organization which targets a specific issue of concern. Many young people after the Revolution of Dignity understood that without their participation, without them being in the political process, no real change is going to be happening in Ukraine. So many of those are running for the parliament, for the local council, and just be part of the active citizens of Ukraine. So this is what civic education course also gave me. That understanding that me and many young people, even an individual, is able to make changes, is able to create changes. Of course, it's always good to have people who believe in that. And that's what the Revolution of Dignity and the civic education course after gave us.
Thank you very much, Rashid. And if I may ask, what led you personally to become engaged and become so active in your community and beyond?
Excuse me, could you repeat the question?
Sure. I was curious if I could ask what led you to become engaged and so active in your community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I do think that the values I have been I've got from the course as well, from the civic education, from what I saw and what I heard. Before being enrolled in a course, in a civic education course, I had not really participated in the life, and I had not been really engaged that much in social and political life of Ukraine. And again, the course, the civic education course and programs and different projects gave me the feeling that even one small thing I'm doing, leading a discussion or resharing something on Instagram or creating a post about an important issue gave me the confidence that if I'm not engaged, if I'm not part of the change, nothing is going to happen. So that's what gave me that inspiration and motivation to be part of change.
And what would you say to your peers who are maybe less engaged, who are maybe less hopeful about the political situation around them? Maybe they feel like that they can't really change anything on their own. What would you say to those?
I do believe that a lot of people are discouraged because they do think that their participation is not going to change many things. But I do say to my peers and people in general, change and democratic progress is not happening over the day. It's a very long process, but that process is going to bring so much good to the people in general. So I'm saying that your little participation, whether you're going out and voting or resharing something important on your social media accounts, or running for the parliament, running for the local councils, is going to bring changes, because the values you have and the principles you have are the ones what the country is going to be built on. So because the youth of today, I always say it when I talk to my peers, the youth of today will be the adults of tomorrow. So our values and our principles are the ones which are going to guide the world any direction. And I do hope that it's going to be the values of democracy that we're going to promote through civic education, those values and principles.
Thank you, Rashid. I think that's great advice, and I think that can be applied quite widely across the globe. And I'm sure many would find that useful and hopeful at the same time. Now I'd like to zoom out a bit and ask Dr. Karaya to help put this conversation into a global perspective. As a civic education expert, educator, and head of a national network of civic educators, Dr. Karaya has significant experience in civic education curriculum development, teacher training, and quality assessment at schools, vocational colleges, and universities throughout Georgia. She has published scholarly articles in Scopus and other databases and has co-authored civic education textbooks for universities and vocational colleges. Dr. Karaya holds a PhD in political science, and her research interests include politics of memory, social movements, and identity transformation. Tamar, according to Freedom House, in every region of the world, democracy is under attack by populist leaders and groups that reject pluralism and demand unchecked power to advance the particular interests of their supporters, usually at the expense of minorities and other perceived foes. So I wanted to get your thoughts on Freedom House's ominous assessment of the state of democracy globally, and to hear your thoughts on what role does civic education have in slowing or even reversing democratic regression.
Good evening from Georgia, and thank you, Gio, for including me at this the conversation and discussion. And from the data you shared, we see that democracy has not only simply declined, but the process of decline has been accelerated, which means that our effort we done are not enough. The counter effort of the anti-democratic tide is more influential. And we have to remember that world experience that few countries have sustained democratic governance for a prolonged period. We have to remember this lesson because each new generation is a new people and they need to collect the knowledge, learn the skills, and develop the attitudes. And the best way to resist this process is to foster a more vital public understanding of democratic principles. So there is no better option to sustain democracies more than requisite citizens with knowledge, skills, and motivation. In the term public awareness, I mean the combination of information and skills of how to transfer this knowledge into action. And it is a primary goal of civic education. And in this case of a developing country, for example, like Georgia, because I would like to switch the conversation toward the Georgian case, we need more effort because the primary challenge is to develop self-identification toward the state. For 70 years, we used to live in the Soviet Union, where the state system operated beyond us. And 30 years have gone after the collapse of the Soviet system, but we are still in the process of value transformation. For example, CRRC, it's a research center, Caucasian Research Center in Georgia, conducts the Caucasus Barometer annually, and they ask respondents if which of the following statements do they agree. For statement first, people are like children, the government should care for them like a parent. And the statement, according to the statement two, government is like to an employee, like people should be the boss who controls the government. And the result of 2020 survey are the following. The first, 50% voted for the parents and 41% voted for the employee. So you see what kind of result we have. And it's interesting also that 48% of interviewed representatives aged 18-34 have the similar attitude that the government is, the representatives of governments should behave like a parents. And we have to mention that there is no significant difference between the age groups, I mean, in the results. Besides developing knowledge and skills, I think that we must also overcome skepticism toward the democratic value, is, as you mentioned, fed by the fake news. Due to the current social, economic crisis and pandemic, the transition process has worsened. And strengthening democratization and promoting engagement in the community governance is the way to overcome the skepticism mentioned above, and increasing civic education teaching is the way to reach it. Regarding civic education as a course, I have to mention that even in Georgia, various attitudes still exist. Sometimes the school community sees this course as a additional subject less than other established courses like history and physics. And the root of these attitudes we have to look for our Soviet experience, because the type of person, the type of citizens they were rose up, there was no part for the democratic principles. And civic educators, from my point of view, are obliged to not only teach the students, but at the same time they must work with the community to raise awareness of the civic education as a subject, civic education as a value, how to say. Actually, it is enormous and continuous and crucial work that needs to be done.
Thank you. That does sound like a significant challenge ahead of us. What advice would you give other educators who are facing this challenge, who are facing this type of skepticism, perhaps by their students, perhaps by other teachers, perhaps by the government at times? What advice would you give teachers who feel passionate about this and want to develop, strengthen civic education teaching in their own nations?
Mm-hmm. I always say to my colleagues that being a civic educator is not an ordinary type of being a teacher, because civic educators are modern teachers, and that I would try to highlight some of the tips they have to, how to say, think about. The first is to promote team working activities, because this can be seen as a fundament for joining community initiatives, taking responsibilities, creating a bridging social capital, the connection between social groups, social class, ethnic, religious, or other important social demographic or social economic characteristics. Also, from my point, team working skill will help them become better citizens, because citizenship somehow is following rules of the community. And other tip is to use many participatory methods as possible. The evidence shows that role plays, small group exercises, and group discussions are far more effective tools for improving knowledge about democratic practices and the values than more passive methods. And another is to promote engagement in local self-government. Actually, citizen participation in decision-making services as the fundament of local democracy. Is a fundament of local democracy, and local self-government at a more direct level is a more direct level than central government. It absolutely fits the famous expression that it is for the people and by the people. And teachers can simulate the governance strategies, including hometown meetings, petitions, and etc. And these tools are valuable for the local democracy development process. I also mentioned that they have to pay attention to the specific issues, including gender, ethnicity, and gender. For example, in case of gender, women generally face more tremendous obstacles to participation than men in terms of resources or cultural barrier, particularly in the developing world, for example, like Georgia. And programs that address these more profound barriers to participation may be required over and above civic education to reduce the gaps between men and women. And finally, I see that action projects can be seen as a practicing process of all the above mentioned skills. And if we have time, I would give an example which from my point of view is very For example, one challenge for Georgian higher education institutions is adaptation environment for the students with disabilities. And years ago, group of students conducted research and found that approximately 8 students graduate schools for visually impaired. But only a few of them managed to continue their studies at the universities, because no universities and no persons with disabilities are ready for this step. It's some kind of to jump out of the box. And to advocate this adaptation process, my students from Tbilisi State University, decided to prepare an audio version of the Democracy and Citizenship textbooks, which then was published with support of IFES Georgia. Then we asked to support for the Open Society Foundation and equipped university libraries with the supplies working on the Braille system, I mean the printers, scanners, or literature, and etc. And same time, students organized workshops and study tours for the visually impaired schoolers, and they also organized a lot of mutual events. And it's interesting that this year I have a student with disabilities. Her name is Anna, and she's an alumni of the visually impaired public schools. And now she can use those facilities at the university library created by the previous students. And it is the best example of how students can engage in the university development process and made it better place for all of them. And this is job that teachers should promote.
Thank you, Tamar, for that inspiring example. I can't help but recognize the contrast of the paternalism you referenced through some of the national polling, contrasted with this very clear ownership of a problem by some of your students and the demonstration of their own agency to solve or improve the problem. So I very much applaud you and all of your colleagues for all the great work that you've done over these years. And thank you once again for joining this discussion. Next, I would like to ask Sadia Afrin to join our discussion. Beyond the classroom, Sadia leads a number of civic education initiatives for students and young people across Bangladesh. Sadia is also a moderator for Students Against Violence Everywhere and a facilitator for IFES's She Leads program that strengthens the skills of young women to emerge as leaders. Sadia, I would like to start by reading you a quote by American sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson. Wilson once posited that the real problem of humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Do you agree with the statement? And if so, how should we deal with our ever-evolving godlike technologies? What type of challenges and opportunities do civic educators have in the digital age?
Thank you so much, Gio, for inviting me on this program, Turning the Authoritarian Tide Through Civic Education, that is hosted by the International Foundation for Electoral Systems and the Global Democracy Coalition. It's really a matter of great pride and honor to be a part of this panel discussion, and you excellently introduce me and also mention a quotation that reflects the digital age in present time. Yeah, in present digital age, the digital transformation in education, especially in civic education, education is the learning experience of both educators and learner that improve their skills to create a more engaging and effective education process. And the importance of digital learning may help the young generation, the young learners, to engage in civic education and share their experiences and ideas in a transformative approach. And in this new age is usually called the fourth industrial revolution. Here, artificial intelligence and digital platforms are making this new stage in history. Now, We can witness a radical transformation in the way we communicate, we learn, we teach, and even have fun. And of course, technology has the power to support and transform civic education, and it directly affect education, transforming a teacher's role increasingly into a knowledge facilitator who integrates digital technologies and methods into a educational process to foster a citizenry that is formed, engaged, and champion democratic values. Here, I want to mention some keys of the education in the digital era. Firstly, we can say about the classroom that without limits. Here, learners not only learn when they are in classes. Digital extension allow them to interact with the contents and the educator at any time. In addition, they can access to endless content and resources. Secondly, we can say about the new role of the educator, which is so much important, and already Tamar excellently explained the role of the civic educator to encourage or spread the democratic values over the citizens of any country. The educator no longer transmits knowledge in one direction. He or she now can be a coach, a guide for the individual development of the learners, and he or she can promote teamwork, problem solving, creativity, and advocacy also. And technological tools should never be understood as a substitute for educators. On the contrary, they enhance their role. After that, we can say about the personalized learning. Because of the flexibility of digital tools, students are now no longer passive subject in education. Now they can define and participate in their achievements. They benefit from an individualized, interactive, and simulating learning process, which will help them to become an active citizen of the country. Fourthly, we can say about everything is much easier in this digital era, and it is in many of these educational platforms, evolution is automatic and gamified. This is a relief for educators who will be able to decide their time to plan interactive and dynamic face-to-face classes, and evaluation turns into a positive tools. And finally, or the final key of the education in digital age is higher motivational. And in civic education, by using their own language and following dynamic and interactive learning methods, students will find a greater satisfaction, and also the educators will benefit from this extra motivation in their students and will enjoy the comforts technology offers them. Well, while many aspects of civic and political life increasingly occur online, these changes or transformation also create some risk and challenges for the educator as well as learner also. For example, it is often difficult to judge the quality of information found online or in digital platform. Misinformation, fake news is definitely a major challenge for the educator in present time. Here, there are also enormous challenges in diversity, equity, and inclusion that need to be addressed. Here, I want to mention the protest in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, which shed light on just how far still we need to go in order to create a truly equitable civic education. It's not just about access and inclusion. It's about realizing what we have been teaching in civics primarily from one perspective. We need to make sure that we are teaching civics from the perspective of all people. Here I want to mention another challenges for the educator is that the tools for engagement have changed, but our political, social, and economic vulnerabilities haven't. Educators imagine focusing on a kind of teaching and learning that puts democratic community life in front and center at the same time, that it uses changes in digital technology to their advantage. There are both worthwhile goals, but they are not one and the same. If we care about a robustly democratic society, we will have to be explicit about this kind of knowledge, skill, and dispositions required of democratic citizens. Another challenge I want to mention here is that it is very, very difficult to engage all participants, all learners in online platform, and all the educators are not well trained, especially if we mention in our country's example that the educator are not well trained and not technically advanced like this new generation. So even curriculum are also not so much effective to promote or engage young in civic activities. Here I can share my own experience about teaching democracy in my own institution. In my university, there are 34 departments, but only five departments under the Faculty of Social Sciences are teaching democracy, but their curriculum is not well suited for promoting democratic culture or society. Democracy in this department is taught theoretical and conceptual issues only, but contextually, teaching democracy in practice or practical sense is absent in our universities, not only my universities, but the other public universities in Bangladesh. I want to wrap up my discussion by focusing some other challenges that the educators in Bangladesh are facing in the digital age, that are the highly expensive internet price, slow internet speed, and sometimes no internet in remote areas, and not having proper knowledge and training in handling digital devices. Even shortage of service are also some major challenges that educator has, I think. And these challenges and inequalities uh, create great inequalities in the societies.
Thank you very much, Sadia, for sharing these opportunities and for also very importantly pointing to some of the inequalities that are increasingly exposed through the digital age, and especially for emphasizing the challenges of shifting from theory to practice in a way where students and individuals can apply what they're learning in their everyday lives. Thank you very much for making all of those and many more important points. I would like to now bring back all of our participants, if I may, back onto the screen. And we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I'll read a couple now, and I want to see if any of our panelists would like to respond. So we have one question that asks, why has democracy declined as student enrollment rose? Is this a coincidence or a contributing factor? Can civic education engage with people excluded from higher education institutions and work at the grassroots level as well? So I open the floor if any of the panelists would like to respond to this question.
Gil, I'll offer some input. I'm not exactly sure what the comment means about as student enrollment has increased. I don't know if that specifically means that we have more enrollment at the university level. I'm just not sure exactly what that question is. But the other part of the question about and I'm going to couple this with a question that came in also about the decline of civic education in the US. And I want to clarify that I would not say that we've seen a decline of civic education in the US. On the contrary, in recent years, we've seen a lot of legislation to mandate civic education. So I think that the issue for me goes back to, again, the quality and the purpose. And in my own work, I draw on the work by Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator and activist, and he wrote the book "The Pedagogy of the Oppressed." And Freire talks very succinctly about the fact that education can be a tool for liberation or a tool for oppression, or a tool to maintain the status quo. So I think that we shouldn't confuse the idea that because we are educating more people, that necessarily means that we are educating them for democracy. Education can very effectively be a tool that maintains the status quo, and or also uses the people to be agents of the state. I'm prompted to share a quote that a university student in Ukraine said to me many years ago when we first started bringing this course to Ukraine. And she was a political science student at a very prestigious university in Ukraine. And she said to me, "We are taught what to think, but not how to think." And I think that that's a statement that I could even apply to many institutions here in the United States and globally, that the problem is not, just educating individuals is not the answer. It's how we're educating individuals. Are we teaching them to think critically? Are we giving them some of those experiences that we've heard about today, where they are actively engaged and they can recognize their own agency? So I think that it's a crucial distinction, that it's not just increased civic education, it's the quality of that education.
Thank you for your, yes, Tamar, please.
I would like to add a few words also, and we have to understand also that there is a difference between the rates of students who are enrolling at the universities and who are staying out the university. That's why it's very important to make civic education stronger at secondary schools, and also it's important to make it stronger at the vocational level, because civic education must be accessible for everyone equally. And I absolutely agree with the Greer that there is a huge difference among the declining democracy and declining the civic education. I can say that the civic education declined. We are trying more and more, but unfortunately, there are, very influential tides from the anti-democratic, sources. They are trying to overcome our voice. So we are trying to somehow battle with it.
Thank you. And connected to anti-democratic forces, we had another question on asking for advice on how can an individual promote civic education or interactive teaching or active learning in closed societies, where perhaps the civil space is a bit closed, more closed than in others. Where should one start, and what advice would you have for those?
Okay, I'll take a crack at it. I always feel a bit challenged with questions like this, because I recognize I have tremendous privilege that I live in a pretty stable democracy. And so my experience, what I'm able to do with my students, I recognize does not necessarily transfer. In fact, it doesn't transfer to all settings. So I want to be like very upfront about, I fully appreciate that that is a reality. But I can talk a little bit about some of my experiences in working with educators in societies that are more closed. And what we do is we look for opportunities. We look for where's there an opportunity for an inroad. So in one country that I was working in with educators, where there was a lot of a lack of opportunity to address certain issues regarding gender, we looked at where are the spaces where we could address like issues of equality and issues of advancement for individuals, and how to advocate for that within the system. And so what we were able to do is to look at specifically opportunities for individuals with disabilities and how we could examine current status and historical status and law, and teach students how to use the processes of government to improve conditions and create more equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities. So it's really a question of kind of taking the context as it is, but looking for the space where we can, because in that process, the students are still obtaining so many of the skills that we're talking about and the dispositions. And I will add one thing that I've noticed, and I've been doing this work now in developing democracies for over a decade, and I've noticed an absolute difference among the students. Students are aware on a level that a decade ago they weren't, and I absolutely believe it's because of the internet. So even if a student is living in a closed society, students have awareness of what the potential of democracy looks like in other settings, and they're hungry for that. So I think if we just give them even small spaces where they can start to develop some of these skills, we're making inroads there that later we can build on.
Thank you, Greer. I think you made some excellent points there. If nobody else would like to add to that, then I would like to ask all of the participants now at this final stage of the discussion. As I mentioned at the outset, one of our goals of today's discussion is to compile some of the main messages and some of the main recommendations of the discussion and share it with the organizers of the Summit for Democracy that will be taking place later this week. So if I may ask each of the participants to share your top recommendations for turning the authoritarian tide through civic education. You're also welcome to share any reflections you have on any of the points any of the speakers made throughout the conversation. So maybe if I can start with Tamar, and we can go one by one. Tamar, over to you.
Thank you, Gio. Actually, I have two recommendations, and this recommendation equally fits to as policymakers, as civic educators, because these recommendations are related somehow to each other. And I think that the first is to foster, they have to foster institutional democracy in school and universities. It's very important, because civic education as a course needs to be acknowledged by the administration and by the colleges and teachers, how to engage and work harder to this direction, and the makers have to support somehow this process. And the long-term goal is to promote the establishment of civic education tools in school and the universities, because democratic principles like transparency, tolerance, pluralism, or diversity can be developed as in civic education courses as math, physics, literature, or chemistry equally, and we have to somehow promote this process together.
Thank you, Tamar. I'll turn to Rashid for your recommendations.
Thanks a lot for asking this. I have a recommendation on how we can battle authoritarianism and move towards those values of democracy. I would say that education has to encourage students to cooperate, in a classroom and beyond classroom. This is what I honestly had during my course, Democracy from Theory to Practice, is cooperation and working on solving a common issue. There were student projects, and we had to think of the ways on how we can make a positive impact. So this is the first one, is cooperation and working together on solving a common issue. And the second one is encouraging, is the civic education that encourages students to, first off, not be afraid to speak up, creating this atmosphere. Again, this is what I remember, creating the atmosphere by the professors and by the course itself at its core, that everyone has an opportunity to speak up and voice their opinion. So these two are vital, in my opinion, for any progress, for the democratic progress, as cooperation and given a chance without being judged, respecting each other's opinion to young people and people in general. And one more comment, if I can, about Dr. Greer's speech and to the previous question. I do agree with what Dr. Greer said. It's just especially about the internet and looking for different opportunities you can use, as well as the values. So I do think that we also should start from the basics, as respecting each other's opinion, debating a question, whether you stand on different sides of a certain question, as debating with respect and compassion. So this is how you could structure that and build up to more important questions that you might have, and which will happen over time. So this is my little comment and to the previous question and to recommendations.
Thank you for the recommendations and for that insight as well, Rashid. I see a lot of heads nodding on our video, so I think we're all very much in agreement on the importance of all that you said. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to Sadia, if I may ask you to offer your recommendations.
Thank you again for giving me the floor. I truly believe that the digital age would bring greater access to information that would strengthen democracy. But I have also witnessed a darker side of digital age, more specifically the internet. And we now see some countries who are not practicing and believing democracy, interfering in the political activities like election or so on in the other countries worldwide. As a result, the core aspect of democratic process are deeply stressed and broken, and democracy is now under threat. So only civic education can provide the precondition for the social inclusion and equal participation of global citizens in the digitalized democracy. So my recommendations are, uh, first of all, the global governance. The global governance can combat authoritarian practice through various institutions and structural framework. And global community need to promote civic education seriously and should impose civic education as a prerequisite for promoting democracy, liberty, freedom, and human rights. And my second recommendation is democratic state can frame a conditional foreign policy with the state practicing democratic norms and values in a limited range with a view to combating authoritarianism. And democratic states can spread democratic values over the world, and can arrange more and more seminars, workshop, and activities to engage youth all around the world, to engage them in civic activities, to become a active citizen, to enlarge their knowledge about democracy, citizenship, human rights, freedom of expression, and to become an active citizen. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sadia. Two additional excellent recommendations for the international community. Greer, I'd like to hand it over to you for your recommendations.
Thank you, Gio. First, I do want to say that I absolutely agree with all the recommendations that have already been offered. So what I'd like to add to that, though, is if I have to kind of distill it down to two things that I think absolutely are necessary at this moment in history, not just here in the United States, but globally. The first is to expose students to diverse viewpoints, and give them the skills to critically assess the material that they are confronted with, and to develop those kinds of digital literacy skills of like bias detection and whether or not the information being presented has been manipulated. But that they need to not just have those skills, but also to be confronted with diverse perspectives, and then opportunities to work through those diverse perspectives through civil discourse. I feel like that is one of the most important things that we are really lacking right now in the United States, is that we're losing our ability to talk to each other across diverse perspectives, and we're losing the ability to form opinions form reasoned opinions from an educated, informed perspective. So I think that those are probably the two most important things that I think need to be included in any civic education program. But I want to just piggyback onto what Rashid said, because I think Rashid is just a glowing example of what civic education can do. He talked about the fact that he had not previously been engaged. So what was the turning point for him? And the turning point for him, I believe, based on what he said, is the opportunity for authentic learning, the opportunity to have a voice. And that was through a student action project that the students in his course complete. So while I absolutely think that the need to be exposed to diverse perspectives and the need to be able to critically assess information are two vital components that are needed, I think we also have to keep this component of allowing students authentic experiences to exercise their civic potential to problem solve in their own communities in order to develop that sense of efficacy. And the last thing I want to say, Gio, and I know I'm going a little bit beyond what you asked me, I've been sitting here thinking again about this idea of closed spaces, and the comments that were just made about how the internet can be used for really a force of evil, which we all are recognizing is the potential. But it's also been used as a powerful tool to mobilize. And I'm sitting here looking at some of my colleagues and friends, Tamara from Georgia and Rashid from Ukraine, and the people there have shown so powerfully that the people, when the people come together, when the people organize, when the people speak out, they have effectively overturned authoritarian governments. So I don't, in spite of the fact that there's so much that we do have to fear right now in terms of what's happening in our world, I still have faith that if we give the information and the tools to the people, that the people will fight authoritarianism.
Thank you very much, Greer, for that hopeful and inspiring final point to the recommendations. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rashid. Thank you, Tamar. Thank you, Sadia, for your thoughtful reflections, for your recommendations. To me, it sounds that it is crystal clear that a holistic approach toward sustained democratic progress cannot be achieved without full support for effective civic education at home and abroad, full stop. And we do recognize that civic education is not a panacea. And as we are reminded, though, by our participants, that civic education is an essential life experience that can significantly increase individuals' self-efficacy and agency, as Greer was just describing, while anchoring these in democratic values that are upheld long after graduation. So thank you again, everybody. And I would like to thank once again the panelists. And we, as I said, look forward to sharing these recommendations with the Summit for Democracy. My sincere thanks also to the Global Democracy Coalition and International IDEA for their partnership, as well as to the United States Agency for International Development, Global Affairs Canada, and UK Aid. It is through their support that our efforts to strengthen democratic progress in Ukraine and beyond is made possible. Another very special thank you goes to our team in Kyiv, who have been working hard behind the scenes in preparation for today's discussion. Tatiana, Ina, Alexandra, Anton, thank you for your amazing work as always. Last but not least, I would like to thank all of you, the viewers, who have joined us from near and afar. I encourage all of you to stay engaged ahead of the Summit for Democracy by visiting the Global Democracy Coalition website. That's www.globaldemocracycoalition.org. There you'll find a recording of today's discussion, as well as a schedule of the other discussions throughout the day today. Thank you and goodbye on behalf of all of us at IFES, your partner in building democracies that deliver for all.